fluttered his wings anxiously, his violet feathers ruffling as he studied the summoning circle before him. The runes were perfect, the incantation precise, and yet something was wrong. The air crackled with energy, but the form standing within the glowing glyphs was unlike anything he had expected. "Where am I?" the figure asked, its voice deep and resonant. It had no fur, no scales, no proper talons, just smooth pinkish skin and a bewildered expression. Recalled in shock. What are you?" demanded, his beak clicking in frustration. He had meant to summon a familiar, a mighty beast to aid him in his duels. Instead he had this thing. The creature blinked. "Our name's Jake. Pretty sure I was just in my apartment. And now I'm here. Care to explain?" Groaned inwardly. "This was not going to plan. I am of the, and I summoned you to serve as my familiar in battle." Jake rubbed his chin. "Yeah, no, that's not gonna work." Feathers bristled. "It has to work. The spell was cast correctly. You must be capable of something." Jake gave a shrug. "I mean, I can do a lot of things, just not the usual stuff you're probably expecting." Took a step back, still processing the situation. "Do you have any supernatural abilities? Flight? Strength beyond measure? Elemental manipulation?" Jake shook his head. "No, just a regular guy." Clacked his beak in irritation. "This cannot be." The summoning ritual was designed to bring forth a warrior. He began piecing, his tail flicking behind him in agitation. "This must be a mistake." Jake crossed his arms. "Or maybe your magic works differently than you think. Maybe it summoned what you needed, not what you wanted." Stopped, his golden eyes narrowing. "What I needed? That is absurd. I need a fighter, not a..." He gestured vaguely at Jake. "Human." Jake sighed. "Well look, if I'm stuck here, might as well figure something out. What exactly do you need me to do?" Hesitated. He had been training for this moment for years, preparing to bond with a powerful beast that would guarantee his rise among the warriors. Instead he was stuck with this being with no discernible combat ability. "You must assist me in duels against other summoners. Our familiars better, and victory brings honor and prestige." Jake scratched his head. "All right. Do I get a weapon? Armor? Magic powers?" Sighed. "Familiars fight with their own innate abilities, which you appear to lack." "Great," Jake muttered, running a hand through his hair. "So I'm supposed to go with some kind of giant thing? That's fantastic." Actually," corrected. "And you would be crushed instantly." Jake exhaled, trying to suppress the rising frustration. "Okay, so clearly we need a different approach. Can I use tools? Maybe set traps?" Scoffed. "That is not the way of the. Combat is a test of power and skill, not trickery." Jake gave him a long look. "Power and skill? Look, I don't mean to be rude, but if that's the case, why did you need a familiar in the first place?" Feathers fluffed, a clear sign of his irritation. "The bond between summoner and familiar is sacred. It enhances our strength, allows us to work in harmony." Jake sat down on the ground, stretching his legs. "Okay, so let's rethink this. You needed a familiar, and you got me. Maybe we weren't meant to fight in the traditional way. Maybe our strength is somewhere else." Hesitated. As ridiculous as this human was, he wasn't entirely foolish. "What do you propose?" Jake grinned. "Give me some time. I'll come up with something." Tilted his head, skeptical but intrigued. Maybe this wasn't a complete disaster. Not yet anyway. Jake sat on a rock, watching as, pieced in frustration. "So let me get this straight. You meant to summon a big, bad monster to help you fight, and instead you got me." "Exactly," squawked. "I was expecting something with claws and fangs. Not a furless ape." Jake rolled his eyes. "Well, sorry to disappoint. But hey, I'm not completely useless. Humans are good at." Sighed. "Do you have any combat abilities? Can you breathe fire? Spit venom? Fly?" Nope and nope. But I can think. And I've got hands. Which means I can build stuff. fluffed his feathers in exasperation. What good is that in a fight? Jake smirked. Give me some time and I'll show you. The next few days were filled with bickering, but Jake was determined to prove his worth. He spent hours gathering materials, tying vines together, testing different techniques. Watched in bewilderment as his so-called familiar built strange contraptions from sticks and leaves. What is this supposed to be? Asked, eyeing a crude net stretched between two trees. A trap, Jake replied. If your enemies are bigger, stronger, or faster than you, don't fight them on their terms. Change the game. Let out an irritated chirp. This is foolish. Combat is about strength and skill. Sure, Jake said, wiping sweat from his brow. But it's also about winning. You wanna win or look cool losing. Hesitated. He didn't like the idea of relying on something so unconventional. Still, there was something compelling about Jake's logic. The day of the duel arrived. Opponent, a heavily armored, growled menacingly as the fight began. The crowd of avian onlookers cheered, expecting a swift and brutal battle. Braced himself, still unsure of Jake's plan. Jake, standing on the sidelines, reached into the small pouch he had fashioned from leaves and twine. All right, buddy, remember what we practiced. Groaned. This is ridiculous. But as the charge he acted. With a flick of his talons, he pulled a cord Jake had tied to the ground. Instantly, the net sprang up, entangling the legs. The creature stumbled, crashing to the ground. The crowd gasped. Wasted no time, diving in to claim victory before his opponent could recover. Jake whooped from the sidelines. Told you. Traps work. Shook his head in amazement. Maybe humans aren't completely useless after all. After the duel, and Jake sat together, watching the sunset. I must admit you are different. But effective. Jake chuckled. Yeah, humans are pretty good at thinking outside the box. We don't have claws or fangs, so we make tools. We don't have wings, so we build machines to fly. Looked at him curiously. You are not like any familiar I have ever heard of. You are more partner than servant. Jake smiled. Well, maybe that's the problem. You wanted a familiar, but you got a friend instead. Consider this. Perhaps humans did not make good familiars. But maybe, just maybe, they made excellent allies. Opponent stood across the battlefield, a massive, covered in thick, plated armor, its glowing eyes locked onto him. The crowd roared in anticipation, eager for a brutal and decisive duel. Felt his feathers tighten with anxiety. This was not a fight he could win through strength alone. On the sidelines, Jake crouched, watching with intense focus. All right, buddy, remember what we practiced, he called out. Flexed his talons, glancing at the inconspicuous cords and traps Jake had helped him set up earlier. This is still absurd, muttered under his breath, but he had no better plan. The moment the duel began, the charge, its heavy footsteps thundering across the battlefield, took off into the air, dodging the initial assault. From his vantage point, he could see Jake moving quickly, keeping an eye on the beast's path. Nah! Jake shouted. Dove, just as the stomped over the hidden trigger. The ground beneath it collapsed as vines snagged upward, tangling around its massive legs. The beast let out a furious roar, struggling against the snare, but the harder it fought, the tighter the bindings became. The crowd gasped in disbelief. No one had ever seen tactics like this before. Wasted no time. He swooped down, striking swiftly at the beast's exposed neck. The impact sent the crashing onto its side. A sharp whistle blew through the air. The duel was over. Headvan. The arena was silent for a moment before an eruption of cheers shook the ground. Jake punched the air. Told you. Landed gracefully, breathing heavily, his heart pounding from the rush of victory. He turned to Jake, an expression of disbelief crossing his avian features. That actually worked. Jake smirked. Tactics and strategy, my friend. You don't need to be the biggest or the strongest if you can outthink your opponent. Glanced at the fallen, still tangled in the trap. This will change everything, he murmured. He had always believed in combat being about sheer power, a test of might. But this? This was something else entirely. The other warriors in the audience murmured among themselves, some in awe, others in outrage. Knew this battle would spark debate, perhaps even controversy. But he didn't care. He had won. Maybe humans aren't so useless after all, said looking at Jake with newfound respect. Hey, that's what I've been saying. Jake laughed, clapping him on the back. So what's next? Eyes gleamed with something close to excitement. We train. We refine. If these tactics work once, they will work again. And next time, we will be even better. Jake grinned. Now you're talking. Together, they walked off the battlefield, the air buzzing with whispered speculation. It was only the beginning of something greater. Knew what had to be done. There was no victory left to claim, only survival. He convened the last of his war council, the few remaining commandants who had not succumbed to despair. The decision was unanimous. They would retreat. It was the only option left. But retreat was easier said than done. The humans knew they were winning, and they had no intention of letting their enemies escape. Every attempt to launch evacuation ships was met with immediate retaliation. The sky was a killing field, filled with fire, stolen alien technology, to hunt down any vessel that tried to flee. Entire fleets were wiped out before they could even break the atmosphere. The only hope was a desperate, coordinated retreat. A distraction. A final sacrifice. Issued the Aeordan, half of the remaining fleet would stay behind to buy time for the others. They would fight to the bitter end, drawing as many human forces as possible while the escape ships attempted to flee the planet. It was a plan born out of necessity, not strategy. He knew the fate that awaited those left behind, but there was no other choice. The battle for retreat was as brutal as the war itself. The aliens fought with every ounce of strength they had left, but the humans fought harder. They swarmed over evacuation zones, turning every landing site into a massacre. The last transmissions from the doomed half of the fleet were garbled screams, desperate pleas, and the haunting sound of human laughter echoing through the calms. Barely made it out. His ship was among the last to break through the atmosphere, its hull scorched, its engines barely functional. As he looked back at the planet below, he felt a chill run through him. This had not been a war. This had been a reckoning. Earth was not a world to be conquered. It was a world that consumed those foolish enough to challenge it. And humanity was not just another species. They were something far more terrifying. As his fleet limped away, he knew one thing for certain. They would never return. Earth was that world. And they had just learned, too late, why no one had ever conquered it before. The remnants of the alien fleet drifted through the void, battered and broken. They had escaped Earth, but not without cost. What was once a mighty invasion force had been reduced to a fraction of its former strength. Their warships, once symbols of unparalleled power, now limped through space like wounded animals, their hulls scarred, their systems failing. High Commandant sat in silence on the bridge of his flagship, staring at the remains of what was once his fleet. The retreat had been a nightmare. They had lost more ships in those final moments than in the entire war. The humans had hunted them down as they fled, as if determined to ensure no invader ever lived to tell the tale.